Hi, everybody, and welcome to this week's edition of Straight Talk, sponsored by Inglis and Daly. My name's Bren O'Brien, and joining me, as per usual, is Tim Rowe. Today, the $10 million filly that won't make it to the track, new additions for Coolmore, a new look for Waikato, and the mare's sales catalogues build. In racing, the latest developments in the Racing New South Wales ATC saga, the mounting impacts of fuel costs, on-track updates, upsides from the championships, and do fillies and mares have an unfair advantage? While in wagering, punters' issues with Whirlpool, and the fallout from pending reforms to gambling advertising. Tim, great to have you aboard as always. We got the news yesterday that Quincenario, the Piero filly out of Winx, had been retired before she even made the track. Not completely surprising, I suppose, Tim. We've been hearing for a while that maybe she wasn't a horse that was ever going to, or wasn't quite going to live up to what she was able to do. There's probably a little bit of an element here that a horse like that, you can't just roll the dice and hope that they turn out all right, because she wanders out in the track and she's unable to, you know, yeah, if she wins 1 from 10, then she's got to get smashed anyway. So I think, the probably common sense decision was made there.
That's right. There was talk, before she was even sold, and we were both at that Easter sale. It was quite phenomenal, the number of people that turned up and the mainstream media and attention for weeks in advance of that sale. And, we both bumped into Debbie and Paul Kepitis before she went through the ring, and I did with Paul, and he was concerned someone might outbid them. And I think we all get caught up in the money and the headlines, but what Winx did for Debbie and Paul and her family or their family and the rest of the owners, took them on a ride of a lifetime that has said it's generational mare Winx, and they've got an attachment to it. They're fortunate they've got the financial capacity to keep hold of a filly like that, but it was never about money. It was keeping hold of attachment to that family and to Winx. You never know what can go wrong with horses. So while it's disappointing that she didn't, go onto the racetrack or make it on the racetrack, just the attachment to that filly, I think, that was what it was all about, and shouldn't get caught up in the money. And maybe they sell some yearlings out of that mare, that filly, who knows? But hopefully she can go on to produce something half decent. And even Debbie says in the audio we'll hear in a second that good mare, top mares don't go on to produce, good horses. I think that's a bit unfair. There's Winx and Black Caviar and, even Autumn Glow now, they're so rare. You can't expect a horse to reproduce something like that, even half as good as, better than the average. So, I think that's a bit unfair on Winx as well. And, Debbie touches on quite a few subjects.
Yeah, she does. We'll get to that audio in a little minute. I guess some of the cynicisms come out. Oh, well, $10 million, what a waste. This is the greatest waste of $10 million in history. Look, Tim, you and I know there's plenty of probably $10 million stallions out there that have been pretty much a bust from the moment that they sort of stepped out. So there's plenty of opportunities. And I guess it's just about context and sort of seeing how this was. I think this filly, regardless, was never going to be able to live up to what Winx was able to do. Winx is a once in a century horse, if that, probably once in a forever horse, like what she was able to do. We won't, like, Autumn Glow maybe Autumn Glow will make a nonsense of this statement in the next 18 months, but like what Winx was able to do would be dominant as she was, put her in such a rare air and rare context. I think, I think some of the cynicism around it, I can understand. And yeah, of course, that, effectively Debbie bought out her other shareholders of the horse through a process which is much publicised. But, that's the nature of how it works. And like, credit to them for putting the horse out there, because it did create great buzz and great sense around it. And yeah, I think, I guess it's easy to sit there and say, well, that's $10 million down the hole, but it's not really, because you're buying generational talents. And I'll give Debbie, Paul, but Debbie in particular, credit. She stood up in front of this and talked about this horse, and she was the face of Winx. She was, in terms of the ownership, because she was probably the most accessible. But they had a remarkable ride with her. And I tell you what, they're not sitting there now going, geez, we wish I hadn't have done that. Like, you can tell, and we'll go to Debbie now, but you can tell in the tone of her voice that, she wanted this horse to be a champion. But when she realised that she wasn't going to live up to anywhere near her mum's ability, then it just wasn't worth, them persisting with her.
Oh, look, the decision was easy in the end. It's, unregrettable. We wish we hadn't had to make that decision, but, she just wasn't up to it. So when she was being broken in, she jumped around in the paddock and hurt herself, and that was why she took so long
Yeah.
To sort of get into Chris's system. And look, she was too important. You couldn't have her, not perform at her best. So that we felt that was, more important. And ultimately, she's got a fabulous pedigree.
Yep. And when you did buy her, well, I imagine, I know you were clearly attached to her for obvious reasons, but it wasn't possibly about what she could do on the racetrack. It is a longer term play.
Absolutely. She was always a long-term a prospect. Like from the moment she was born, we just had fallen in love with her. And it took a lot to decide to buy her. It took a lot of money to buy her.
Yes.
But, like we always knew she had the pedigree. And history says that generally really good race mares don't produce fabulous race horses, so on the track. So, that you always have that in your mind. You know that there's a chance that they won't live up to their expectations. We really would have loved to have taken her to the races, but you just don't want anything happening to her, that would look detrimental to racing, if nothing else.
Yeah. So have you thought about a maiden mating for?
No, that hasn't even entered our heads yet. That'll be something that we'll contemplate over the next couple of months. We're not going to rush into it. We want to see her settle in the paddock as a broodmare and see that she lets down all right, or whether we need to give her another year off. But no, ultimately, the five of us will nut that out in the next 2 to 3 months.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but you do have, because I think you've got the Coolmore Colt Syndicate, so presumably shares in Home Affairs and
There's Shinzo,
Switzerland.
but you've also got, a lot of other fabulous sires, and Coolmore's now bringing Delacroix down.
Yeah.
You'd have to look. It's not a quick decision, and ultimately, it's stick a pin in the wall and decide that way too.
Yeah. Obviously the Schnitzel colt unfortunately had to be withdrawn from the Easter sale.
Oh yes, how annoying was that? Look, he just had a hiccup in his prep, and you can't take. Look, you wouldn't have taken any horse.
Yep.
That was a little bit, suspect for the sale. You want them to be at their best. So he needed a few months, and he'll be right again.
Well, how do you sort of go about selling him, or buying other partners?
No idea.
Yeah.
We're just getting back to being perfect.
Yep.
And we'll see what time frame that is and make that decision then. That's a group ownership decision. It's not mine. Ultimately, we're not a racing group anymore.
Yeah.
But look, that's a decision for down the track. It's speculation, and I don't like speculation.
Yeah. And Winx, how's she herself? Where's she at?
She's looking fabulous. She actually glows when she's in foal, and look, she's as happy as she's ever been, and we're really looking forward to seeing, do we get a filly or colt out of by Too Darn Hot? It'll be exciting to see the next baby she produces.
Yeah, and probably can't answer this right at the moment, but would she go to stud again this year, or at the moment, unfortunately, well, you've given her years off for obvious reasons. That yeah.
Look, that's another group decision. I think personally, if my 2 cents, I'd give her a year off. But there's a whole group of us, and we all have to sit down and chat about that. There's no right or wrong to that decision. She would only ever go back if she was healthy and happy. So, there's a lot to play out before we even have to go to that decision.
Yeah, so interesting one there. Great, always good to hear from Debbie Kepitis, and again, I'll give Debbie a credit. she's always put herself forward, happy to talk to the media. And there's probably a lot of people in this situation who might have sat there and said, "Nah, we'll go quietly," or just tick her over into the retired box on Racing Australia, and nobody will sort of notice, and it'll be a blip on the radar. But she's happy to talk about it and happy to talk about what's coming forward in the future. It's some exciting things there going forward with the Schnitzel Winx Colt, which obviously didn't sell at Easter, but it'll be interesting to see what happens with him, where he ends up, and even with Winx herself, with what going forward, Tim. So there's this story in terms of the next generation of Winx has only just begun. It's not just the old cynical sort of like, great mares don't produce great racehorses. It's just, we could talk about it till the cows come home, but it feels to me like, there's a lot more to come in this narrative yet. We'll move on now, Tim, to talk about obviously it's stallion roster time. We get a lot of announcements at this time of year, probably in the next month throughout April. We'll probably have one a day across this period from the major studs, and the other studs talking about either stallions that they're standing for the first time or announcing their fees. There's plenty of sort of to look around this, but it was interesting to see earlier in this week Coolmore come out and confirm that Delacroix is coming out to Australia, son of Dubawi. I would think probably a bit like the enthusiasm for shuttle stallions in Australia is probably greater than it was 5 or 6 years ago, Tim. Is that probably fair to say?
Yeah, well, I guess Too Darn Hot's got a fair bit to do with that, and Gaius, Dali, have had a bit of success at the moment with some really successful shuttle stallions, so I guess that puts them on the radar, and they do bring different pedigrees, in this Danehill-centric stud book that Australasia has really. So, that's part of it. Yeah, Delacroix is an interesting addition to the ranks, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, we've also got Waikato confirming their fees yesterday. Interesting to see, obviously, a bit of a new start to them, return to Conquer, stepping in, but obviously Super Seth no longer there. Savabeel on private, and probably if he's in his last couple of years at stud, depending on what's going on. I mean, it's an interesting time for the Chittick family. It's a bit of a time of transition for them, isn't it?
Yeah, I've spoken to Mark Chittick multiple times in the last few months before the sale of Super Seth, after, and even at East, subsequent to Easter sales and different things like that. They are going through a bit of a regeneration, not just with the stallions, but reevaluating their business, or their thoroughbred business, with the family involved, George and Charlie, and very different members of the family. They're all getting involved, and sort of just you can't. What worked sort of 20 years ago is sort of different now. The costs of production have gone up, so they're just reevaluating all that, and hopefully Return to Conquer can be be a successful stallion for them.
And we've also got Swettenham confirmed their fees early. I think it was late last week. Toronado. Also, Diego Velazquez making his debut in Australia as well. So that Victorian market's an interesting one at the moment. And look, Swettenham they've had an amazing run with Toronado. Probably been a bit unheralded, really, what he's been able to achieve, both here in Australia but also in Hong Kong. He's a serious sire who had a bit of a setback last year, but appears to be back in full health and ready to go, Tim.
Importantly, they were able to get him back, and he did serve. He sort of had a pretty busy November, so that'll help keep his momentum. It's just it's very hard when these stallions have a year off. The Autumn Sun, Morris, Satono Aladdin in New Zealand, for various reasons, either injury or there was the pandemic, couldn't get them here. It just halts the commercial. People are very much here and now, what's happening. So it will affect that, but the fact that they got good numbers to him in the latter half of the season will really help continue on his momentum, and probably the later foals probably won't disadvantage to the Hong Kong buyers at all or anything like that, given they give them time. So they're well placed there at Swettenham with Toronado, and a fast son of, or a Group 1 winning son of Frankel will be an interesting addition to the stallion ranks as well.
Yeah, and obviously, Tim, we're building towards the mare sales, and only about, I think, 4 weeks away today until the chairman's sale, and we've also got the Magic Millions Broodmare sale. The chairman's sale confirmed Cheyenne joining the ranks of the chairman's sale this week as a supplementary. The 2-year-old, which is an interesting one, but also a trio of Tiaco mares set for sale on the Gold Coast, where it's kind of interesting. We're getting this notion now, I suppose, of release these catalogues, Tim, which is fine how they want to do it, but it feels like we're going to get released lot by lot. But that's fine. That's obviously helps gather greater attention for the mares involved, and it's part of the marketing strategy of the sales companies.
Yeah, definitely. I think I wrote a month or 6 weeks ago probably that Magic's had changed their strategy slightly, and I think it's working. Both there's probably a lack of depth or number of fillies and mares off the track, just they're not available or they've been bought privately. So I think the catalogues are, well, Chairman Sales already come together, and Magic's, I think, is coming together quite nicely. At that top end, it'll just be interesting to know how many, I don't know how you want to describe them, the middle market mares will go to public auction rather than, or live auction rather than online. You know, Inglis has even got to drop their Australian broodmare sale live auction that was the day after the chairman's sale, just online, because just the cost, or people are, you know, feeling they're getting well paid online and can trade them that way. So it's an interesting dynamic that's changed in the last sort of 3 or 4 years.
The following segment is brought to you by Inglis. Star 2-year-old filly Cheyenne and well-related Group 2 winner Filia are among the first confirmed supplementary entries for the Inglis Chairman sale. The Annabelle and Rob Archibald trained Cheyenne presents one of the most exciting opportunities in recent memory for owners and breeders to acquire a race filly with incalculable upside. Cheyenne and Filia join a significant group of high-class fillies and mares set to be offered at the Chairman sale, including Group 1 Goodwood Handicap winner Benedetta, Triple Group 1 winner Provence, and millionaire mares Arabian Summer and Generosity. Also available is a share in Extreme Choice, whose yearling averaged more than $1.5 million at the recent Inglis Easter yearling sale. To view the Chairman's catalogue, go to inglis.com.au. The auction will be held at Riverside Stables on the evening of Thursday, May 7th from 4 p.m. and will again be held with the Where Elegance Meets Excellence theme. Tim, on to racing now. We'll briefly touch around this one. It was interesting to see the ATC and Racing New South Wales sort of come to a compromise, I suppose, on some of the interim funding measures while they sort out their legal stoush. We're obviously covering the legal stoush fairly closely. What was interesting is that probably the man that they basically brought in someone, the ATC brought in someone to have a look at their hospitality business, which there's been some questions around and some issues around alleged theft and etc. like that. So they brought someone in, but of the 4,958 auditors that they could have brought in, they've brought in Morgan Kelly, who is the man who was actually charged with being, or was actually brought in to be the administrator of the ATC initially before the ATC applied that. It's an interesting dynamic. It feels like there's, racing tends to go around in circles and bump itself in the head a little bit on some of this stuff. And in this instance, we probably raised an eyebrow when we saw this, but again, it probably was not surprising in some aspects, Tim.
No, he must obviously. Morgan Kelly's obviously very well equipped and to manage these things. It did. The first thing that came to mind for me was it honestly could make a Clark and Door skid, and I did watch one this morning, which this must have been the algorithm about a oil ship crashing, into the sea and things like that they did, I don't know how many years ago. Made me laugh. But yeah, that was the first thing that came to mind. Sometimes you can't make up these things in racing. This is genuinely what's happened. And we're told that Morgan Kelly won't be reporting back to Racing New South Wales. It is to the ATC. So obviously, yeah, it'd be interesting to see what, if anything, he uncovers there and what could be done better to make the hospitality part of the business more profitable, presumably.
Yeah. I mean, again, he's fully qualified and, not saying he's got the right man for the job, certainly not. But it is interesting that the same names keep coming up. I guess what is interesting too, Tim, is that probably shows a little bit of I'm trying to think the best way, a little bit of a breaking of the ice between the club and the regulator in this regard, albeit that they're set to go back to the Supreme Court from an appeal perspective in May, and what will be an interesting thing itself. But yeah, this story keeps on rolling on, as too does the mounting impact of the fuel crisis. Issues with obviously we've had on a global level, we've had the concept of a ceasefire in the last 24 hours. Lord knows how long that'll last. But it's interesting how this flows down. Like the costs to the racing industry are significant. Probably one of the first major impacts or first interesting impacts in Victoria, which actually was kind of buried a little bit. The lead was kind of buried yesterday. Was a race meeting in Mildura set for later this month has been moved to Swan Hill, which is 200 kilometres closer to civilization. No, I won't say that about Mildura, but primarily because of the cost of fuel and getting jockeys and trainers and all those sorts of people to Mildura, which is Victoria's most remote racetracks. Significant from that point of view, Warwick Barr, who's covered this issue quite closely, spoke to both Yeppoon and Rockhampton in the last couple of days about measures they're taking. Because Racing Queensland have not yet been able to get to a point where they've been able to come up with some solutions around fuel, topping up trainers, etc., to be able to travel. Well, we're hoping that fuel prices will come down a bit now, but we can't be guaranteed. And I kind of feeling this one's got to roll on a little bit, albeit I think Racing Queensland are meeting with some representatives today, and there may be an announcement today. We'll see what comes out of that. But, Tim, it's hard to see this one going away because the cost of training's hard enough, let alone when you're paying twice the price you used to for diesel.
In Racing Queensland, it's got financial challenges, but also just the size of the state, and they manage 3 codes as well. So, like, Victoria and New South Wales just have to look after thoroughbreds. If they do it for one, presumably they've got to do it for all 3 codes, even though the harness and dogs are sort of, well, certainly in the southeast of the state, are fairly centrally located. There is Townsville and Rocky Dogs and places like that, Bundaberg. But yeah, presumably they've got to do it across all 3 codes, which added cost and added burden that they've got to consider. I mean, it'd be interesting to see if they can come up with some sort of monetary response today, at least ease the burden, because even, if this ceasefire continues or there's an agreement, I don't think fuel prices are going to go way back to normal anytime soon. And I'm certainly no economist, put it that way.
Yeah, yeah. Things you've probably got a bit more expertise in, Tim. We moved to things on the track, and obviously we're in the middle of the championships. We had a great first day, really interesting first day of racing. Obviously, she's an alibi, confirmed herself as an absolute star. Green Spaces probably defied his pedigree to win a derby, but a great effort from Bjorn Baker. And obviously the other Group 1 winner as well, Campione D'Italia stepping himself as a future stallion. And yeah, plenty to sort of take out of that first day out of Randwick. But moving ahead to this week, we've got more Group 1s this week. Obviously, Tim, plenty to look forward to. And you've put a little article together on the straight about how the results of this week could shape what might happen from a stallion roster perspective for the likes of Arrowfield in the next few weeks.
Yeah, won't change or wouldn't have changed the breeding value, but I think Paradise Storm's coming out of the Sydney Cup, which is unfortunate for those owners, and got a few mates in that horse and gave them a great thrill in Auckland, and just a little injury setback, unfortunately, by the sounds of it. So I think he's coming out of the Sydney Cup. But yeah, just, Coolmore have announced that, Delacroix, as we touched on, a service fee, and Waikato's just announced theirs. But the others, Hunter Valley studs, will be sort of announcing in the next probably fortnight to 3 weeks, I would say. And what happens on Saturday will have a big say in that. I'd say the Autumn Sun's already going up, regardless with Autumn Glow. Probably doesn't change a lot, but if you can side the winner of the Oaks and things like that, and sort of add sort of multiple good horses out there, can probably add, I don't know, 10 to 20,000 on some of these service fees, particularly younger stallions. Like if you look at Newgate with Stay Inside, if he can get back-to-back stakes winners at the championships, which is extremely conceivable, it will make a big difference. And breeders making their mating decisions, commercial mating decision, made in the next couple of weeks as well. Sort of recency bias kicks in.
Yeah. Well, it is an industry built on recency bias, Tim, and that leads us to our next topic, which is, do fillies and mares have an unfair advantage given they're giving 2 kilos an open age and open sex races, particularly Group 1 races? And it's prompted on the fact that I'm just trying to remember now. I think it's 8 of the past 12 Group 1 races at open age, open sex Group 1 races have been won by fillies and mares. And obviously we had She's an Alibi destroy them on the weekend. She probably could have carried a fair few kilos more and still won. So probably not a great example, but Jolly Star was an example where she was very good, but, and I think 5-time Group 1 winner now, like, so a serious horse. But, would it be the same if she was on exactly the same weights? And I guess the debate comes up here and there. But what we are seeing, Tim, and Run the Numbers delved into this week, is that compared to 20 years ago, things have changed significantly. When 20 years ago, 18.3% of races which were open age and open sex Group 1 races in Australia were won by fillies and mares. It was 25.8% in the 2010s. And the 2020s to date, it's 33.6%. So we're seeing much higher percentage of fillies and mares winning these races. Now, they are probably, participation rates are probably up, and we'll study that probably at a later date. That will take a little bit more research and maybe a little bit more time. But for me, it's an interesting one, Tim, because I think that it does point to a challenge that the industry has. Whether or not it's a factor or not, I do think it needs to be studied, looked at, discussed, and worked out what the path is forward, because more and more people are coming out with this concept that perhaps, it's unfair for the fillies and mares to have that 2 kilo advantage.
Well, I think you'd have to do it with the data across the whole horse population rather than just the top 2 or 3%, the elite horses. You got a handicap for the entire population. And so the data, the fillies and mares win more benchmark 58s than they used to, and things like that. That's, you can't just handicap for the best horses. I think that would skew it. So that's my first point. Is this a longer term trend? I guess your article says maybe, but is that because of steroids that the geldings don't have? I saw a couple of suggestions about whip rules have made a difference. Who really knows? But I don't think the handicappers, or they should change. And it is an international standing as well, that they go and change that just for the best horses, when it'll affect the betting market significantly. I would have thought if they made a difference across the board and reduce it to 1.5 kilos or a kilo or whatever it is, that would significant effect on the betting markets, whether positive or negative, I'm not sure.
Yeah, there's a bit to play out in that too, and it's probably been skewed in the last 15 years by the fact we've had champion mares like Winx, Black Caviar, Very Elegant, Via Sistina, these horses that won a lot of Group 1 races and have come back and won repeated Group 1 races over the journey, and that's probably sparked for discussion. I do think it's a discussion worth having, but also I think we've got to move beyond a debate on social media and actually, probably have some form of way to actually analyse this. The following segment is brought to you by Darley. Darley stallions continue to shine at the recent Easter yearling sale. Too Darn Hot had a record sale with a best price of $2.2 million and an aggregate sales of over $7 million. Adamo grossed nearly $5.3 million with a top price of $900,000 for his first crop of yearlings. Street Boss, Pinatubo, Blue Point and Bivouac also hit the board. And little wonder, Darley stallions have sired 1 in 5 Group 1 winners this season and 1 in 6 stakes winners. So you're seeing at the very top, you're seeing it week in, week out, and you're seeing it right there in the catalogue. Choose Darley. Right, now to wagering, Tim, and an article I'm actually working on at the moment, which will probably go up on the straight mid-Thursday at this stage, so it'll probably be up by the time this podcast is up. I've been going through, this discussion about the whirlpool, like it's another one that's probably a favourite of the social media set, but it is a factor, and it's something we've been talking about for a while. I know you and I probably every Saturday, one of our chat groups often comes up here, but the number of, times that, significant discount on Whirlpool compared to what's on fixed odds. I've been through the numbers, Tim, which I love to do, as you know. There've been 18 Australian Group 1 races in the run involved the Whirlpool this spring, and only 4 times has the Whirlpool dividend been higher than for the winner, Whirlpool dividend being higher than the fixed odds dividend. Now, that's to be understood because obviously Whirlpool takes a higher percentage out. Fixed odds operates, I've just got the numbers here in front of me, 116.4% is the average market percentage of tab fixed odds, because I did it with the tab comparison, compared to 122.8% for Whirlpool if you go across those markets. So that's probably not surprising. What is interesting is, this is a stat that I pulled out, right? So there's been 192 Group 1 starters in those 18 races, right? So if you go through all those races, 192 Group 1 starters. 53.6% started at better odds on Whirlpool than they did on fixed odds, while 40.1% started at a shorter price. There was 12 starters who were at the same price. So on that basis, Whirlpool offers better odds on the longer odds horses. What is fascinating, Tim, is of those 18 winners of those races, 11 of those have been won by horses whose Whirlpool price was at the greatest discount to the offer from fixed odds. We've had a higher number of favourites win races, but I guess, Tim, is this just the fact that the nature of favoured markets, or does it point to broader concerns about Whirlpool and I guess how Australians perceive it? I mean, what's your sort of take on this?
Well, it'd be interesting if Tabcorp are lobbying the Jockey Club to sort of lower the takeout. Obviously, over there in Hong Kong, bigger punters get a rebate. We know the big syndicates get a rebate from Tabcorp anyway, and the Jockey Club. So their price, they're actually getting a better price. But what I will say, this is not unusual. When punters bet into the tote, they know the game, they know the percentages and if you're backing a favourite or a horse ridden by Zach Purton or James McDonald or a well-known horse, by and large, almost certainly it's going to start shorter on the Whirlpool. So no one's forcing you to bet there. There's fixed odds. You can bet elsewhere. There's Betfair. So there's plenty of options open to the punters. So in that way, I don't feel sorry for them. You know what you're in for. It's like when people blow up about deductions. No one's forcing you to bet before scratching time or anything like that. I know there's some overs and people are very good at knocking those off early, but by and large, you're probably better off waiting for the last 10 minutes anyway. So there's a lot of gripes that you can have in this game, but again, it comes down to personal preference and choice. choice at the end of the day, and you do have choice over here where Hong Kong punters don't.
Yeah, I think $1 and $6 in Australian racing is currently spent on parimutuel betting, so it's a small part of the market, but it's a quite a high profile part. I think mainly because if you flush the odds up after the race, we see the tote odds straight away. The only thing is for me is that, and obviously the national tote will be a different product because it'll have different margins associated with it and be a it'll be less of a cut going through. But does the fact that Australian punters in a parimutuel context have been sort of taking worse odds on winners for the better part of 2 months now. How does that impact sort of, Tabcorp's, move towards a national tote and this sort of idea that the national tote could lead to a revival in parimutuel wagering? Because for me, if you don't have price certainty, which you don't in a parimutuel environment, it makes it difficult. And the other thing is, Tim, is if you're betting in Hong Kong, you don't have any other option. You don't have fixed odds as an option. I can't see how there's going to be a massive revival in parimutuel betting in Australia unless there's a price element driving people to do that. And so I think that, you know, this it's probably not the way you'd like to market the virtues of parimutuel betting and tote betting with the world pool paying significantly less out on these horses. Through a run of results that have sort of gone that way, but it's becoming quite a groundswell now amongst the punting public.
The tote's advantage or Tabcorp's tote advantage will be it's probably not so much the win pool, it's the exotics and quaddies and things like that. So, if they can get those pools bigger, I know I've looked at some of the smaller pools on Sunday. I was betting somewhere, and there were, two, yeah, there were some jackpots into those, $2,000, and mightn't sound like much, but it made me bet into the first fours and the trifectas just because there was, that money spread across all the runners, and there was a few no hopers in those races, so it made me to bet into them very small dollars. Don't I'm still here showing up to work, so it wasn't that profitable, but there is some appeal there if they can get the pools up a little bit and, maybe have incentives with jackpots and different things like that. There's plenty of certainly marketing options open to them if they genuinely want to try and make it a competitive space or offering to punters. I guess it's just even Tabcorp probably making more out of fixed odds than what they were the tote, so there was no incentive to really market it. But Gil McLaughlin has made it sort of, he's been at the forefront of trying to revive it.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. And I think, yeah, I mean that you're right that perhaps the win and place, becomes, or win betting becomes the domain of fixed odds, or has become the domain of fixed odds anyway. But maybe that's not where the market share might be. And yeah, I mean there is, I guess price certainty is something that people will move towards. But anyway, interesting and part of that. Quick one to round off, Tim. Obviously, not long after we got off air last week, our Prime Minister stood up and gave the strongest announcement yet around gambling advertising restrictions. We've covered that extensively on the straight. If that interests you, have a good look through it. But there's probably a few points to pull out of this. And the first one, Tim, will be how it will impact the racing industry. The expectation is that racing will get a carve out, and so racing publications won't have to be subject to this rule. That's an interesting one, assuming it happens, which we're pretty sure it is. But there's probably a few other questions, there's an article there which I wrote, I think late last week, which sort of deals with a few of those issues. I think it'd be good to hear and know that the racing industry is in the room having these discussions about these likely impacts and what might happen, because I think if racing's not in the room on this, just assuming that everybody else is going to take care of racing's interests, I don't know if that's necessarily the best way forward. There'll be further sort of coverage of this as well coming up, because the government have put out, or one of the government departments have put out what they think will be the impact of these reforms. And they're talking probably in the realm, I think, of about 0.6% of wagering turnover or wagering spend being affected, which is not a great deal for what they're trying to achieve. So this one will play out over the next 6 to 8 weeks. We'll go to Parliament. They'll come back into Parliament early May, introduce the legislation. It'll be picked over and we'll have more analysis about it, Tim. But I mean, it's probably not something that the everyday punter is talking about, but it's something that could have a significant impact on the broader, but certainly the wagering industry, but also the racing industry as well. Do you agree to that?
Yeah, I listened to the Prime Minister's press conference the other day. I think it was Tuesday, and obviously he's got a lot going on with Middle East crisis and different things, conflict and things like that. But he was asked by a journalist about some particulars about the wagering reform and, whether podcasts would be exempt and things like that. And, possibly fairly, he was non-committal about that. He probably didn't know, because they are the minute details that haven't been certainly put out publicly. And things like who's a celebrity and who's not, and if they're retired, are they still a celebrity? If they're using a sports people to promote, a brand, a wagering brand, all those little things that seem, probably populist, but in practice, is it possible to achieve that, or is it fair? Who knows? There's a lot to play out yet, I would think, before the full impact is really known. And even with you said about the statistics on wagering, well, most people have got an account already. If there is to be a downturn in wagering, it might become, the new footy season or the head into spring or autumn and things like that. When people are, their dormant accounts, they stake them up again for the spring or autumn to have a bet, and there's fewer incentives or whatever, free bets and things like that.
Yeah, maybe just see how it pans out. We'll have all that coverage across the straight over the journey. Thanks for listening to us on Straight Talk. Thanks for spending your time with us. Of course, Straight Talk brought to you by our sponsors, Darley and Inglis. Don't forget to give us a rating wherever you're listening to our podcast. Be sure to subscribe. Send us an email, editor@thestraight.com.au. Let us know what you'd like us to talk about. Thanks for your time, and we'll talk to you again next week.